Overpopulation. Big problem, small world. By myself. This photo right here is a picture of Monaco. Monaco has the highest population density in the world. Imagine if you had lived here. The environment would be congested and dirty and frankly disgusting. And your quality of life would be next to none. Your local politicians would have failed you to provide affordable or even just cleanly housing. So a little bit of context on the issue. China, for example, is another major superpower, not just the US, that's already struggling with overpopulation. It's a global issue. They have already implemented a one-child policy, which they have recently redacted, but the effects are still being felt today. Populations are projected to grow by 1.76 billion persons, according to stimulus source D. And finally, the continued rapid urbanization of the planet, as we see in stimulus source B, diminishes not just Americans, but globally citizens' quality of life because places they've been to, have memories, the places they want to go are no longer available because of the urbanization, which we see in stimulus source B, as the author talks about how a oceanside retreat he used to go to is now covered in housing and isn't as accessible as it used to be. Three of my main perspectives that this issue is going to encompass is environmentalists, and that also includes environmental health, current and future generations, and politicians. So the environmentalists. More people alive means more carbon emissions. And more carbon emissions means more natural disasters. Natural disasters such as hurricanes, tsunamis, and air pollution. This affects current generations, of course, because hurricanes and tsunamis can destroy housing and even kill people. And it also affects future generations because the air pollution, it doesn't just go away, you have to prevent it in the first place. And so if this current generation doesn't take care of the world, for our future generation, they're going to be living in an environment that has been drastically affected by overpopulation. And finally, fossil fuels are main, if not one of our main, if not the main, source of our energy, will be running out as soon as 35 years, and that could be even sooner if the previous projections are true, which is 1.76 billion persons by 2024. So the socio-cultural lens. Overpopulation can cause a diminished quality of life, crowded activities, again seen in source B. He wasn't able to go to his oceanside childhood, where he went in his childhood, by the ocean, and there are now fewer resources. And this can completely devastate a culture. This graphic over here on the right is demonstrative of, the length is demonstrative of the population, the actual sheer number of people. In figure A, you can see that there are many more people. In figure B, there are less, but the width is supposed to be demonstrative of their quality of life. And it's a very simple graphic, but it gets the point across. This is thinner and longer because the more people you have, generally, the less quality of life you have because there are fewer resources, and you have the crowded, congested environments that source B and source D with the projections have demonstrated, and just the picture of Monaco that I showed you to begin with. So the political lens. Politicians have an obligation to protect the environmentalists, the environmental health, and just the environment in general, globally, and society. To protect cultures, the entire society as a whole, and because of this, politicians need to control resource use to preserve economies, the environment's health. So it's a mutually beneficial thing. You have to preserve the environment, not only for the environmentalists and because that's where you live, but because the economy will also benefit from keeping the environment healthy and accessible. So will society. That helps the need to keep quality of life as high as possible. When you have a stable, healthy, lush environment, not something as I have shown you, the picture of Monaco, when you have an environment with plains and actual vegetation, things of that nature, the quality of life is much higher. And politicians have an obligation to do this for their citizens globally, not just the US. And so this goes back to the current and future generations, another one of my perspectives that I mentioned. politicians need to ensure the environment can sustain the later generations. As I mentioned earlier, the later generations are going to have to deal with things like air pollution and a lot more natural disasters due to the carbon emissions that overpopulation can create. And because of this, politicians have an obligation to preserve our world for a better future, and just a future where we can actually sustain human beings, or the population we have now. So I propose what China has already done, a global version of it, however, a one-child policy. Each couple may only have one child. So this graphic is showing you, this is the span of the one-child policy at the bottom, as labeled. And you can see that there's a drop-off over time. The orange is the birth rate, and the green is the death rate. The death rate stays pretty stable over the course of time. The birth rate declines severely over time due to this one-child policy because no one wants to break the law. And due to this, China saw a lot less air pollution, and it saw a lot less, a lot better quality of life, which the government is also responsible to try and regulate for its citizens. A quote from the South China Morning Post said, "New births in China fell to 15.23 million last year, the lowest since China relaxed its one-child policy in 2014. So this policy wouldn't have to be forever, but globally, we should at least implement this for a couple years, if not even a decade, because even after you relax or completely get rid of the policy altogether, we are still seeing that the birth rates are beginning to decline. And I understand that an implication of this is that a limitation of this is that not many would like to give up their liberties and their rights that we've previously had, because as it stands in the U.S., for example, we can have as many children as we wish as long as we take care of them. And then I understand that not everyone would want to give up their liberties, but it's necessary in order to have the human race in the future. Because if we are having births at such an unprecedented and unregulated rate, then it could spell disaster for the future and for the rest of society, and not just the people I mentioned, the current and the future generations, and the politicians, and the environmental health, everyone, everywhere globally. So there should be a global one-child policy implemented. That's all I would say.
Okay, a couple of questions for you. First one is, what evidence did you gather that you didn't use, and why did you choose not to use it?
So I gathered evidence specifically from Monaco, the place that I showed. The reason I didn't actually put that in there is because it's not indicative of the globe. Like, that's the most extreme case you can find on the face of the planet today. And I figured I could include that, but it wouldn't help my argument as much as just having a big picture statistic or a big picture look as I took in my presentation. Because if I had included a statistic, which I believe was about, like, it was a specific number of population density, because it's higher than anywhere else in the world, I didn't think that would be indicative of the solution I'm trying to highlight, because again, it is the most extreme case in the world, and not everywhere it's like that, or else it wouldn't be the most extreme case.
Okay. And then your second question, what advice would you have for other researchers who consider this topic?
If I were to give someone advice on researching this topic, I would advise them to think in depth the role the government has in actually regulating something like this, because we already saw that China did something like this, but I don't think people realize that the government has more of a pull on societal and cultural and environmental causes than they really do. Like, most people think of politics and they just think of Republicans and Democrats, and the Green Party is almost always ignored. But even if you're not part of the Green Party, I don't think people understand or realize that politicians have a much larger role in overpopulation and controlling things like this because of the implications it has on other things. So overpopulation, you would think the government can't just take away your liberty, but overpopulation means you could potentially destroy the entire human race. So the government needs to be proactive in in their approach to such an issue like this, even though it doesn't seem like they should have a prevalent role in an issue like this.